Eamon Phoenix is my name. I'm a political historian and broadcaster. And our aim today is to talk about the background to the partition of Ireland, the creation of a separate entity in Northern Ireland in 1920-21, and the story of the Boundary Commission of the 1920s and how the borders of the new Northern Irish state were finally firmed up by 1925. Best to say at the beginning that if you stopped someone on the Falls Road or Portadown in 1910 or 1911 and even suggested that within a decade Ireland would be divided by a hard border into two, if you like, immensely separated entities, that a lot of blood would have flowed, not just the bloodshed of 10 million lives of the Great War, but the Easter Rising, the Irish War of Independence, and the serious sectarian disturbances which racked Belfast between 1920 and 22 and cost nearly 500 lives. The bystander would have been amazed, because in 1910, 1912, right up to 1921, Ireland had a common court system. It was governed under the Crown from Dublin Castle. The judges came from Dublin. The police came from Dublin, the Royal Irish Constabulary. There was a common customs service. And really, Ireland was governed as one entity under the British Crown. So partition was really completely off the radar until really 1914, when it began to firm up as a political idea. So of course the idea of Home Rule went back to the 1880s, to the leadership of the nationalist movement of Charles Stewart Parnell, a Protestant landlord who came to Belfast in his last months on this earth and said, "We cannot afford to lose a single Irishman." He envisioned a united Ireland, self-governing, under the British Crown. This was what Home Rule was. It was local powers for peace, order and good government, from agriculture to education, but the commanding heights, like finance, like peace and war, they would rest with Westminster. And even under Home Rule, it was envisaged as late as 1914, Irish MPs, whether Unionist or Nationalist, would still sit in their full strength at Westminster. So this was really perhaps a glorified county council. It certainly wasn't independence, and it wasn't even the Dominion status which Southern Ireland achieved under the Treaty of 1921. And yet that's what people in West Belfast, in West Cork, throughout nationalist Ireland were voting for in the years under Isaac Butt in the 1870s, under Parnell in the 1880s, and under Joe Devlin in the early 1900s. For them, of course, it was symbolised with the green flag with the harp. And there seemed to be a continuity right back in the eyes of Northern nationalists to the United Irishmen, the Young Irelanders, right on to the 20th century. But of course, John Redmond, who led this movement from nationalist Ireland, was an upper-class Irishman, an eminent lawyer, a former clerk in the House of Commons, who believed that the British Parliament, Westminster, was the zenith of international democracy. He had worked as a clerk in the House of Commons as a young man, and in one of his most important speeches in 1902, Redmond declared, "We must have home rule and imperial strength." And Joe Devlin, born into a working class family in Hamel Street in West Belfast, the darling of the mill girls in West Belfast, right down to his death in 1934, Joe Devlin believed that Ireland was entitled to home rule, but that Irishmen could take pride in having created the empire from Africa to India, to Canada, to Australia. This is what Home Rule nationalism meant. And so, by 1912, the Nationalist Party of Redmond, Dillon and Devlin seemed to be within sight of the promised land. A crisis in British politics had given the Nationalist Party the balance of power by 1911-1912. The Tories had blocked the Liberals' budget. There were two general elections in 1910, both of which produced a hung parliament. And of course, the Conservatives stood firm square with the Ulster Unionists, an alliance that went right back to 1885, when, of course, Lord Salisbury, the Conservative leader, saw Ireland as the key to the empire. And an eminent Tory leader, Lord Randolph Churchill, came to Belfast in February 1886, and in a famous speech to the serried ranks of the Ulster Orangemen, in the Ulster Hall had pronounced the banns of a marriage between the British Tory establishment and Ulster Unionism. And of course he said that Ulster would fight and Ulster would be right. By 1910, the Conservative Party was led by a man who was of strong Ulster Protestant roots. His name was Andrew Bonar, a close colleague of the Ulster Unionists in their fight against Home Rule. And once again, Ireland was the touchstone of British politics. Now, of course, it's at this stage that Redmond and Devlin persuaded Herbert Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, to introduce a Home Rule Bill for all Ireland in return for their votes for the Liberal Party's radical programme at Westminster. Now, of course, the Liberals brought old age pensions in 1908, national insurance in 1911, education acts. Indeed, their radical policies prompted one leading Conservative, the young Winston Churchill, to cross the floor, abandon the stupid party, as the Tories were called, and join the Liberals in 1903. Of course, Churchill in 1912 famously spoke at Belfast Celtic Park on the Donegal Road in favour of Home Rule. So this is a period when the Nationalists and the Liberals form an alliance at Westminster, opposed by the British Tory party, who fear they will be permanently in opposition. And Bonar is working closely with the Unionist leaders to block Home Rule, and indeed block Home Rule not just for the North, but for the whole of Ireland. Now, of course, it's at this stage in 1912 that the Northern Unionist leader, James Craig, a son of a wealthy distiller in East Belfast, a rather plodding politician who had fought in the Boer War, who had an imperial vision for Ireland and the British Isles. It was then that James Craig persuaded Sir Edward Carson, a charismatic Unionist leader, the MP for Dublin University, the Tory MP with the Dublin accent, to lead the Ulster Unionist crusade against Home Rule. But of course, Carson wanted to use the North, the Protestant North, to block Home Rule entirely for the whole of Ireland. And so Ulster to Carson was a weapon. He was going to use the threat of partition as a kind of a sword of Damocles over the heads of Irish nationalism. He believed that if he took a very strong stand, if he opposed the Home Rule Act by extra parliamentary means, even by the threat of physical force, he would persuade John Redmond to abandon Home Rule and accept the status quo. Now, this was never going to happen, because for 50 years, Irish nationalists had been conditioned to expect, that perfidious Albion would somehow grant Irish nationalists the right of self-determination. And some nationalists on the Falls Road and in other parts of Ireland hoped that Home Rule might be a stepping stone, gradually, to complete independence, to the Republic of the IRB's dreams. But of course, Redmond was simply and solely a nationalist imperialist, and he wanted Home Rule as the final demand of Irish nationalism. And it's in these years 1912 to 14 that Edward Carson and James Craig lead Ulster Unionism, backed by their Tory allies, their friends in high places, in the British military, the men of the Shires, the Tory establishment against Home Rule. It was Bonar, the Conservative leader, who in a famous speech at Blenheim in 1912 uttered the words that he could see no length of resistance to which loyal Ulster would go, in which the Conservative Party would not be prepared to support her. These are the years which see the signing of the Ulster Covenant, the rise of the Ulster Volunteer Force, the first private army in Irish history since the men of 1798. But of course, as they are running to Larne in April 1914, 35,000 German rifles and machine guns, 3 million rounds of ammunition, supported by people like Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, the Chief of Staff of the British military forces, and an Anglo-Irish landlord. As they're doing this, of course, Carson was reigniting the Fenian flame of Irish nationalism. He didn't see it that way at the time, but he was emboldening that minority group in the shadows, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, with their roots in the Fenian movements of the mid-19th century in America, Irish America, and indeed in Ireland, to emulate the example of the North. It was an Ulster cultural nationalist, Eamon McNeill from the Glens of Antrim, the co-founder of the Gaelic League, who wrote an article in Clár in November 1913, praising Carson's army and saying it is taking the most important step towards Irish liberty. He called his article "The North Began," and he was recalling the poem of the Protestant nationalist young Irelander, Thomas Davies, 80 years before, when Davies had talked about the North began, the North held on, the strife of native land. And he was praising the United Irishmen of 1798 for taking a stand for Irish independence. And so out of McNeill's article emerged the Irish Volunteers, bringing in Bulmer Hobson, a former Belfast Quaker who had joined the IRB, Sean McDermott, trained in Ardóigh in North Belfast from County Leitrim, and they encouraged McNeill to call a meeting in Dublin to establish a new force, the Irish Volunteers. And we don't have to go to Dublin to see them, because these are the Irish Volunteers in the Clár area of Belfast on the eve of the First World War. About 3,000 volunteers in Belfast and County Antrim, but 200,000 Irish volunteers throughout the country. Of course, the Larn gun running had brought Ireland to the very brink of civil war, especially as no compromise emerged at Westminster. I say no compromise. In March 1914, as the kind of drums of civil war began to sound across the north of Ireland, the Home Rule Party agreed to an offer from David Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the British government, for some kind of county option for the counties of Ulster. In other words, the Ulster counties could call for a plebiscite, a vote of the adult males, the only people who had the vote, on the question of Home Rule. And individual Ulster counties could opt in or out of Home Rule for a 6-year period. The Nationalists reckoned that this would bring about Home Rule for all Ireland within 6 years. And anyway, there would be no Orange Parliament in Belfast. That was the bugbear of Northern nationalists, that somehow a unionist ascendancy would be established in power in Belfast, a Stormont-type regime. And county option would avoid that. The problem with county option, which of course was now being supported by the rising force of the Irish Volunteers in the north, the problem was that of course Carson rejected it as a stay of execution. And so the Irish question was back in the melting pot. There were menacing displays of UVF and Irish Volunteers in towns. What if a shot rings out in Dungannon or Broadway on the Falls Road? Someone is killed or wounded and civil war erupts. And of course, John Redmond was not a man to identify with paramilitary organisation, but the trend of events by the summer of 1914 forced him to assert control over the Irish Volunteers, this burgeoning force from West Belfast to West Cork. And he feared, of course, that they were being manipulated, as they were, by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, by men like Sean McDermott and Bulmer Hobson, both of whom had been trained in Belfast and were allies of the old Fenian Tom Clark, who was planning a rising when England was in a fatal conflict. And of course that fatal conflict was looming. That was the Great War. Because during these years, of course, the Great Alliance systems were cranking into place in Europe. You had the Central Powers dominated by Germany and Austria. You had the Entente Powers, including France, Russia and Britain. And of course, in August 1914, Britain was to give her casting vote to the Entente Powers and bring Ireland with her into the Great War. And it's at this stage, of course, that civil servants in Dublin Castle were sketching maps. You probably get a sense of them, 3 or 4 senior officials, sketching maps for exclusion. A kind of a Westminster solution to the Irish problem in the absence of agreement. So one plan by Sir James Doherty, the Under Secretary, excluded the whole of the 6 counties from Home Rule Ireland. Another plan included Fermanagh, Sogdown and South Armagh under Home Rule and excluded the rest. But the real reason for this was, as one senior official put it writing about this, he said that, of course, the degrees of obstreperousness in the rival sectarian factions on the borderline were driving this idea of partition. He also wrote of cross-Midland nationalists that they are about the warmest, that is the most aggressive, nationalist he knew. So pens are being led upon the map of Ireland as they sketch out various partitionist scenarios on the eve of the First World War. But of course, the war begins. Redmond's men are encouraged to go wherever the firing line extends. Joe Devlin supports the war effort. 1,000 men, perhaps, from West and North Belfast join the Connacht Rangers, fighting at the Dardanelles and on the Western Front. And of course, tens of thousands of Ulster volunteers. Carson's army will perish, of course, in the Great War. Many of them at the Battle of the Somme, beginning in July 1914. And it's in this vacuum in Irish politics caused by the war that we have the bolt from the blue, the Easter Rising, which broke out in April 1916. The plan by the IRB, Military Council, for an all-Ireland revolt effectively narrowed to Dublin with the arrest of Roger Casement and the, of course, scuppering of the arms ship from Germany. And Sean McDermott summed it up. "We'll hold Dublin for a week," he wrote to a friend, "and save Ireland." He meant saving Ireland from the iniquities of Home Rule, redeeming Ireland's soul as he would have seen it as an ardent Irish Republican. But of course, it wasn't so much the 500 mainly civilians who died during Easter week, but it was the executions of Pearse, Connolly, Clark and their comrades which transformed the Irish nation. Lady Fingal, no friend of Irish nationalism, wrote from her castle in County Meath about the executions, strung out day after summary court-martials, the executions by firing squad in the Stonebreakers' yard of Kilmainham. And Lady Fingal wrote, "It was like watching blood flowing from under a closed door, transforming Irish nationalist opinion from support for Redmondism and moderate Home Rule to a demand for Irish independence and support for a new, ill-formed movement at this stage called Sinn Féin, a new movement with an old name, borrowing Arthur Griffith's name from his failed political entity of 1905. And of course, it's at this stage that Redmond and Devlin began to fear that all the work that they had wrought, that all the nationalist lives sacrificed on the Western Front to win British liberal opinion for an Irish nation would be in vain, unless they could work out a settlement. And this led to the Lloyd George exclusion negotiations of May-June 1916. Lloyd George played the kind of role George Mitchell played in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement. He spoke to the disputing parties, the Home Rule Party in one room, Carson Craig and the Unionists in another, and he tabled the proposals. The exclusion of 6 counties, the present 6 counties of Northern Ireland, from Home Rule. Carson was given a written assurance that partition would be permanent and enduring, and sold it as such to the Ulster Unionist Council in Belfast. Redmond and Devlin were given to believe this would be a temporary panacea, which would be reviewed at the end of the war, and somehow magically a united Ireland would emerge under an Irish Parliament. Redmond and Devlin took their lives, their political lives, in their hands when they addressed a meeting of nearly 800 Irish nationalists from the 6 counties in St Mary's Hall on a day known as Black Friday, 23rd of June 1916, oddly enough the same day as the Brexit referendum. And of course it was at that meeting that by an overwhelming majority of 2-1, the Northern Nationalists voted for exclusion. You could say they voted for partition. This was to split Northern nationalism irreparably. West of the Bann, majority of nationalists in Tyrone, Fermanagh and Derry, backed by their bishops, people like Bishop McHugh of Derry, Bishop McCrory of Donald, a strong Irish nationalist, they condemned Redmond's scheme as a rot. Nonetheless, Lloyd George congratulated Joe Devlin on his great victory for Ireland in a telegram to the National Club in Berry Street that evening. But this, of course, was to end in tears, because although Carson had bought into it on the basis of permanent partition, although Redmond and Devlin had sold it to their supporters in the north as temporary partition, the Southern Unionists, led by Lord Lansdowne, rejected the scheme as a sellout for them, and backed by the great mass of Tory backbench MPs, the scheme was rejected, and Redmond accused, of course, the British government, which was now a coalition government headed by Asquith, of betrayal. This was really effectively the end of the careers of Redmond and Devlin, though they still had a nationalist majority, if you like, an exhausted mandate at Westminster. The following 2 years saw the rise of Sinn Féin, the election of Eamon de Valera, the senior surviving prominent of the Rising, for County Clare in 1917, Sinn Féin winning a string of by-elections. But in West Belfast and in Eastern Ulster, Joe Devlin still reigns supreme, leading his vast ancient Order of Hibernians organisation in support of moderate home rule. It's true to say that in counties like Antrim, Down, North Armagh, the city of Belfast itself, the great mass of nationalists feared partition much more than they wanted an Irish Republic. For the Falls Road Catholic, by and large, down to 1920, for the nationalist in Newton Ards, the real fear was becoming part of a kind of a unionist homeland dominated by Carson and Craig. And that's why they continued to hope that some kind of moderate home rule might triumph through the chaos. The Great War ended in November 1918. A peace conference was held at Versailles to redraw the map of Europe and to make Germany pay, as, of course, the French President Clemenceau put it at this stage. So Lloyd George had become Prime Minister at the end of 1916, and of course the Welsh Wizard, as he was known, was going to find he had bigger fish to fry on the continent than he had in Ireland. A key landmark on the road to partition was the general election of December 1918 in Ireland, of course. The war had ended in November 1918, and David Lloyd George, now Prime Minister, the so-called Welsh Wizard, realised he would have much bigger fish to fry on the continent of Europe at the peace conference at Versailles, where the map of Europe must be recast. Ireland was very much going to be on the back burner for the next couple of years, whatever happened. But certainly one, if you like, talisman of partition was the decision of Edward Carson to transition from his Dublin constituency to what his colleague, the Provost of Trinity College Dublin, called a slum constituency in Belfast, the North Belfast seat of Duncairn. And this was a very sort of inadequate seat for Edward Carson. He came under proletarian pressures, demands for the 44-hour week. We were now on the eve of the great engineering strike of 1919, which would briefly unite Catholic and Protestant workers before the sectarian deluge descended. Carson moved north, though, realising that he had failed in his great objective to maintain the whole of Ireland in the folds of the Union Jack. In that election, of course, Eamon de Valera stood in Belfast Falls, a safe nationalist seat, and there he was defeated by a majority of more than 2-1 by wee Joe Devlin in a very violent election which saw Devlinite mill girls attack Sinn Féin platforms and throw salt in the eyes of Sinn Féin speakers on the Falls Road. So definitely West Belfast was not a Sinn Féin seat in 1918. Devlin's dilemma was, would he take a seat at Westminster and offer some sort of critique to the partition of Ireland, or would he join Sinn Féin in abstention, realising, as he did privately, that Sinn Féin really had the kind of the will of the Irish people in its demand for an Irish Republic. In the end, Devlin came under pressure from church and the Catholic middle classes to lead his tiny party of 6 MPs at Westminster. And of course we can see the election of 1918. And the question is often asked, was there a democratic mandate for partition? In many ways, the 1918 election sees, if you like, 2 landslides in a sense. You have the nationalist you have the Sinn Féin landslide in nationalist Ireland. Because in the 26 counties which later composed the Republic of Ireland, Sinn Féin obtained 65% of the vote, even though about 26 seats in the south were unopposed. They were walkover victories for Sinn Féin. In the north, though, Sinn Féin's victories were only assured by a seats agreement with the nationalists, brokered by the head of the Catholic Church, Cardinal Logue. And what you notice there is that the 1918 Redistribution Act had created new constituencies in Belfast. Belfast went from 4 seats to 9 seats. And of those 9 seats, 8 were unionists. So indeed, unionism is strengthened. It's also strengthened by the tripling of the franchise in Ireland. Many people who were poor in north and south are enfranchised for the first time. And of course, middle-class women over 30 had the vote for the first time. So really, you have this swathe of unionist seats from Belfast in eastern Ulster, and a swathe of seats pointing right across Fermanagh into Fermanagh and Tyrone. And Craig and Carson were going to use this unionist victory in the north as the basis for demand for a partitioned area. What Craig had always envisioned from his earliest political years, a homeland for his own people, on the Lagan and the Bann. And of course, Sinn Féin, in that election, it's very interesting, run most of their key leaders in northern seats. So then Arthur Griffith is returned in northwest Tyrone, in that election. Owen McNeill in the city of Derry. And there seems to have been a policy by Sinn Féin, revealed to me by Maura Comerford, who was an old Republican and the secretary of the Fhrosdáil. Speaking to me in the late 1970s, she said she was convinced that there was a Sinn Féin policy at national level to only run the leaders in the north, because if it came to a compromise on the Ulster question, there would be no kickback from northern Sinn Féin delegates, because of course the northern seats would be sewn up and represented by the Collinses and the De Valera's, and that was very much the policy into the early 1920s. But of course, Sinn Féin stood on a Republican platform, determined to abstain from Westminster and establish their own functioning Republican government in Dublin, Dáil Éireann, which of course was opened on the 21st of January 1919, even though only 27 TDs were able to attend. One man who watched all this from his prison cell was the Ulster Protestant Sinn Féin leader, Ernest Blythe, Arnon de Blythe from Lisbon. Blythe, of course, had grown up in the north, had gone to Dublin as a junior civil servant, joined the Gaelic League, the IRB, and was to become a minister in the Fhrosdáil. And from his cell in Crumlin Road jail, he wrote in his memoirs later, he had been horrified when the delegates composing the Fhrosdáil had declared an all-Ireland republic, because he believed that this would be unattainable, it would split the Republican forces, it would lead to civil war, and it meant that the real issue, the question of Irish unity, was being sidelined in favour of the question of the Republic. It's a very interesting take on all of this, but Blythe was a minority voice, and indeed Sinn Féin began to gain traction, particularly west of the Bann and then in Belfast in these years, as the younger element in the nationalist population began to demand a republic as well. But Devlin remained the dominant force in West Belfast going forward. And of course, on the very day the Fhrosdáil met, the War of Independence exploded in County Tipperary, and that would see the spread of the IRA campaign across the south and west, and eventually creeping into the north by the spring of 1920, with attacks in RIC stations in Antrim and Down, and even, of course, on the Customs House in Belfast in the spring of 1920. By 1921, northern divisions had been set up. The 3rd Northern, spanning Belfast, Antrim and the northern half of County Down. The 4th Northern in South Armagh, Louth. The 2nd Northern in Tyrone and South Derry. And of course, these commands, drawing on the old pro-Sinn Féin volunteers of 1914, people like Dennis McCullough, people like Dennis McCullough in the north, Seamus Woods from County Down, Roger McCorley, one of the main activists in Belfast, Dr. Russell McNabb, who had broken with the Home Rulers to join Sinn Féin and became an important figure in the IRA campaign. They were, of course, now taking their orders from General Headquarters, GHQ in Dublin, effectively from Michael Collins, as the intelligence war and the shooting war enveloped the country at this time. This slide showing how the assassination of a County Tyrone-born resident magistrate in County Clare raised sectarian tensions in Tyrone and Fermanagh following his funeral in the north. And here we have, of course, Belfast in these years became a cauldron of sectarian violence. Now, of course, the reasons for this are varied, but of course, in the political background by 1919, a committee was being set up to determine the future of Ireland, set up in October 1919. It was influenced heavily by this man, James Craig, who was now beginning to overshadow Edward Castle, a declining force, a retiring force, as the leader of Northern Irish Unionism. This was James Craig, who was now, of course, about 16 years in the House of Commons. Even more importantly, Craig was a junior minister in the Lloyd George coalition of Tories who dominated it and Liberals set up at the start of 1919, following the 1918 election. Craig was Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Pensions, later the Admiralty. This meant he was sure-footed in the corridor of powers, and with two other Ulster Unionist ministers, he was able to influence government policy. Of course, Sinn Féin were abstaining in Dublin. The dóigh was effectively suppressed very quickly by the British government. So, of course, they had the influence which Joe Devlin and his handful of Northern nationalists lacked as the cloud of partition began to darken the horizon. It was October 1919 that the coalition government established a cabinet committee in Ireland chaired by Walter Long. Walter Long was an antiquarian Tory MP, something of a political dinosaur always. I mean, a man of the shires who had been briefly Chief Secretary for Ireland, a sworn enemy of Irish nationalism and especially Sinn Féin. And he was the chair of the committee, which would consider the future of this island. Very quickly, the committee, composed of Conservatives and Liberals who had been at daggers drawn on the Irish question only half a decade before, they decided that Ireland should be divided and two Irish parliaments established with limited home rule powers, one for the north and one for the south. And there would be a bond of union between them called the Council of Ireland, which would have, in the end, limited powers allocated to it over railways and fisheries, nothing very important. But of course, as the Government of Ireland Act stipulated, this Council of North and South would have the power to evolve into an all-Ireland Parliament by mutual consent. Of course, James Craig and his 23 Ulster Unionists behind him on the floor of the House of Commons, part of that great Tory dominant force at Westminster, who had a stranglehold on Irish policy, they would ensure that the Council of Ireland was as diminutive as possible. Walter Long, of course, had an issue. What would the acreage of the new Northern Ireland be? They talked about Southern Ireland, they talked about Northern Ireland. Would it be the historic province of 9 counties, including Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, a more logical unit, they decided? All of Ulster dependent on linen, the pull of Belfast in terms of immigration, in terms of economics, in terms of the Great Northern Railway, with that important line from Belfast to Cavan, from Belfast to Derry and into Donegal? Or would they go for a smaller area, 4 counties or 6? In the end, the Long Committee recommended a 9-county Northern Ireland. The reason being that the two communities would be more easily balanced. There would be a narrow unionist majority of about 56%, a 44% nationalist minority. And they somehow felt that with these more balanced forces, there might be more give and take in the new Northern Parliament. But the man who blocked this was James Craig. As I say, he was in the pole position to influence government policy, whereas the Northern Nationalists, Joe Devlin and the Catholic bishops, and of course, least of all Sinn Féin, they were never even consulted about the details of partition, the acreage of partition or anything else. And we have it actually from the minutes of the Long Commission, that on the 13th of November 1919, James Craig made his presence felt. He met a member of the long committee. H.A.L. Fisher, the Minister of Education, and Fisher informed the committee that he had seen Craig. Craig expressed himself against the inclusion of the whole of Ulster in the Northern Ireland Parliament and thought 6 counties preferable. And here's the punchline. The reason given by Craig was, and I quote, Protestant representation would be strengthened. And he also thought 6 counties would be a unit easier to govern. In other words, Craig and the insiders of the Ulster Unionist Council, people like Dawson Bates and Londonderry, they didn't want historic Ulster. They wanted that homeland that they could control with a 2/3 Unionist majority, the 6 counties which became Northern Ireland. Long rejected this, but in the end the government overturned it in February 1920. And when the bill was tabled in Parliament, exclusion was based not on 9 counties, but on 6 counties. So partition was, if you like, making its way slowly through the Tory-dominated Parliament at Westminster, where nationalists were very thin on the ground indeed. And of course the Unionists were shaping it at this time. Craig, of course, was concerned at the, if you like, the overlap of the IRA campaign into the north. Suddenly there were attacks in Tyrone and Fermanagh from across the non-existent border in counties like Cavan and Monaghan, where the IRA was strong. And Craig, in the summer of 1920, demanded the placing of the UVF on an official footing. As men returned from the trenches, they found that there was an economic depression. The shipyard was beginning to contract. It now had 3,000 Catholic workers out of about 20,000. They were seen, of course, as unwanted as the loyalists returned from the front. And so Craig suggested enrolling the UVF en masse in a new auxiliary police force to be called the Ulster Special Constabulary. 3 classes, full-time A specials, part-time B specials, and an unpaid but armed loyalist reserve. By 1922, this force would be 30,000 strong and would be an exclusively sectarian force. The border couldn't have been drawn in South Fermanagh or the Bogside or South Armagh had it not been for the massed presence and armed cutting edge of the Ulster Special Constabulary. Churchill was the man who, from the coalition government, backed Craig. He said, let's arm the Protestants. His phrase in July 1920, that would of course free up police and troops for action against the IRA in the south. And so the UVF is suddenly being recruited, but it's being recruited by a man called Sir Ernest Clark, a senior civil servant, an Englishman, drafted into Belfast to establish the new state. And from September 1920, when he arrives with a table, a chair, and an Act of Parliament, as he puts it, as the partition bill is making its way through an overwhelmingly Tory House of Commons, Clark is not just setting up the specials, but he's involved in the appointment of key officials for the new Northern Ireland government. He's also, of course, negotiating elections in 1921, the various cabinet departments. Without Clark, there wouldn't have been an administration ready to roll in June 1921. And if we read the Clark papers in the Public Record Office, we get a sense, of course, of what's going on. The British government wanted to impose a few senior civil servants from a Southern nationalist background who had key, if you like, administrative experience. One was a man called H.P. Boland, and a senior Treasury official in March 1921 contacted Clark to say, what about Mr. Boland? Clark replied, oh, he was interviewed by Sir James Craig last week, but he wasn't appointed. Need you ask why? Well, of course, he didn't state religion, but that was clearly the reason. This was to be a unionist government for a unionist state. The nationalists were not being consulted at all. And we move very quickly forward, of course. And the War of Independence reaches its darkest depths in November 1920, Bloody Sunday in Dublin, the Battle of Kilmichael in County Cork. Belfast had already erupted with other surrounding towns in political and sectarian violence. The real match to the powder came, of course, in July 1920. Several things happened. Carson made a very inflammatory speech, of course, at Finnehy in Belfast at the Orange 12th, in which he said, following Sinn Féin's success In winning Fermanagh, Tyrone and Derry City under PR in local elections, he said, "We will not stand for Sinn Féin in Ulster. I will call out the UVF." Well, he needn't have worried. They were being reformed as the Ulster Specials as he spoke. On the same week, a senior Northern Protestant RIC officer, Lieutenant Colonel G.B. Smythe, was assassinated on Michael Collins's orders in Cork City. As his funeral made its way north, Unionist sort of tensions were rising. The shipyard was closed for the 12th holiday, and when it opened on the 23rd of July, sectarian gangs toured the yard and ordered all the Sinn Féiners, i.e. the Catholics, to leave. Some were thrown into the tide, many were beaten and bloodied. In the end, something like 9,000 or 10,000 nationalists were driven from their jobs in the shipyard, in the rope works, in linen mills and engineering works. And of course, their fate, the fate of the expelled workers, dominated the diplomatic, if you like, negotiations between Craig and Collins, between Collins and the British government, right into the summer of 1922. In the words of one Catholic businessman who met Churchill about the expelled workers issue in 1922, they were creating a ghetto at the heart of Catholic Belfast. And of course, in response to the Belfast sectarian expulsions, not only did sectarian violence erupt in the streets, but of course you had the imposition of the Belfast boycott against northern banks and certain Belfast firms by Dáil Éireann in Dublin, which, as P.S. O'Hagerty put it in his History of Sinn Féin, was just a blind contribution to the general hate, because it effectively created a border around the 6 counties before partition had even been established by the British government. But of course, we're on the way, of course, to serious violence in Lisburn in the summer of 1920, following the IRA assassination of District Inspector Swansea on Michael Collins's orders, serious sectarian riots in Banbridge in the same year, following the Smith funeral, and soon Belfast is at the mercy of political and sectarian violence, which doesn't end really until the autumn of 1922, by which time, of course, 450 people have died, 60% of them drawn from the Catholic community, which was only a quarter of the population of the city. This violence involved the IRA, largely, but not exclusively, in a defensive role, right through to the end of the summer of 1922, because the violence raged on. Nationalists spoke about a pogrom against the nationalist population. Unionists talked about the siege of Belfast by the IRA. Of course, the Ulster Special Constabulary were heavily involved because they were allowed to bring home their rifles. You have a lot of sniping going on by specials during this whole period. There are several loyalist sectarian organisations, and of course you have the British Army and the RIC involved as well. So this is going on to the end of 1922. It's estimated that something like 50,000 nationalists left the north. Many of them left Belfast, and towns like Lisburn, which indeed saw the so-called pogrom of August 1920, when the entire Catholic business class were burnt out of the town and the parochial house was sacked. Indeed, speaking of Lisburn, Lieutenant Colonel Fred Crawford said it reminded him of the town which he had seen in France sacked by the Germans during the Great War. But of course, elections are held in May 1921 in this frenzied atmosphere, a certain amount of violence against the nationalist voters in East Belfast, but it was a unionist landslide. Under PR, Craig's 40 unionist candidates were returned. And so James Craig proceeded to establish his cabinet, bringing in Dawson Bates, a hardliner in charge of home affairs, effectively the police of the electoral system, Londonderry, who had a visionary view of integrated education. And as he's doing all this, of course, the Nationalists had a pact on the election signed by De Valera, Joe Devlin, which delivered 6 seats each. That didn't reflect the 1/3 of the vote, which was nationalist or Sinn Féin in the election. But there was a lot of bad blood between the Hibernians on the Devlinite side and the IRA and Sinn Féin on the other. And the two parties didn't generally transfer to each other at all, costing them seats in that election. We moved directly, of course, to the King's speech at the opening of the new Northern Ireland Parliament on the 22nd of June 1921, a day which, of course, is remembered recently as perhaps the key date, not just in the establishment of a separate state of Northern Ireland. But in the lead up to the truce of 1921, because the king, of course, called for forbearance and conciliation. He wanted to end the violence in Ireland, which he felt was discrediting Britain's name in the eyes of the world. And the result was eventually a letter from Lord George de Valera in the spirit of the king's words, which led to the beginnings of negotiations. The truce, of course, applied to the whole of Ireland, but it wasn't really operative in the north. And indeed, the weekend of the truce saw Bloody Sunday in Belfast and the Raglan Street ambush, and that violence would rumble on through that summer, that winter, into the dark days of 1922. But of course, the treaty negotiations began in earnest in October 1921. Of course, this is the famous picture of the train wreck in South Armagh, when the King's Guard of Honour, the 10th Hussars, were actually derailed on the Armagh-Louth border a few days after the King's speech in 1921. And Michael Collins, of course, on the eve of the treaty negotiations, came north, spoke in Armagh, for which he'd been elected as a Sinn Féin representative, and told the Northern Nationalists they would not be forgotten in the negotiations to come. But in those negotiations, the Ulster question played a poor second fiddle to national status, the sovereignty of the Irish state. And at the end, of course, the best that Collins and Griffith and their colleagues could get was a boundary commission, which was really ill-considered and indeed very, very ambiguous in its kind of proposals to transfer nationalist majority areas from north to south. The one thing it lacked was a plebiscite, and boundary commissions held all over Europe under the Treaty of Versailles included plebiscites. So in Silesia, for example, split between Germany and the New Poland, areas moved from one country to the other by majorities of 51%. That couldn't happen here because the instrument did not include the provision of a plebiscite, a vote of the people. And of course, the treaty was narrowly passed by the Dáil, but Northern nationalists were now split for the foreseeable future between the border nationalists who looked to Collins and the Commission to bring Fermanagh, Tyrone, South Armagh and Derry into the new Irish Free State, and those in Belfast, Antrim and North Down, who could see no hope for them in the Boundary Commission. They wanted to remain part of a large nationalist minority rather than just a 15 or 20% fragment. And so nationalism is once more divided, as it had been in the north from 1916, and violence, of course, continues in 1922 as nationalist hopes of boundary change are matched by unionist fears, and Craig's resounding slogan of "not an inch" as he addresses his new parliament. The Civil War, of course, breaks out that summer of 1922, deflecting Collins and the Dublin government from the north. And of course, this comes in the wake of two failed pacts between Michael Collins and James Craig, which had failed to end the violence in Ireland and give the nationalists a say in the running of the north. Of course, one piece of unfinished business remained to be addressed, and that was the Boundary Commission. It wasn't until the end of the Irish Civil War, after a period of political turmoil in Britain, which saw, of course, 4 changes of Prime Minister between 1921 and 24, that, of course, the Boundary Commission was established. The Irish government had appointed, second on the right, Eamon McNeill, Professor of History, a Northern nationalist by birth, as their commissioner, and of course Minister of Education in the Free State. The chairman was the English-born South African judge, the tall man in the centre, Mr. Justice Richard Feetham, and the unionist representative, who was given the nod by Craig in private, was of course J.R. Fisher, a former editor of the Northern Week newspaper in Belfast, a unionist newspaper at the time. And of course in late 24 and 1925, they of course toured the border from Carlingford, Lough to Lough Foyle, eventually interviewing something like 500 witnesses, taking 130 depositions, and their job was to determine where the new border would go. Did Collins really expect massive boundary change in favour of the Free State? Did he really think it would act as a kind of a magnet to force James Craig to accept a federal Ireland? It's doubtful. In a letter to a Northern Sinn Féiner in February 1922, a private letter, Collins wrote that the Boundary Commission might result in minorities which Dublin would find it impossible to govern. Better, Collins said, to focus on a united Ireland. He's really thinking of a federal Ireland in which the Unionist government and police force will continue to operate, but will send their MPs to Dublin instead of London. If that's the case, of course, the Boundary Commission took evidence at South Down, South Armagh, Fermanagh, Tyrone and Derry, but it became clear very early on to nationalist witnesses that the chairman, who was really the key figure, was determined to maintain Northern Ireland as effectively the same entity which had been created in 1920. When he came to Derry in 1925, he said to the local nationalist MP that the inclusion of Derry in the Irish Free State, and remember Derry had a huge hinterland in County Donegal, it was the capital of Donegal, and the railway centre, and the industrial centre, and port. Nonetheless, he said, transferring Derry to Donegal, which was moving at a couple of miles, would be, quote, a serious surgical operation. It's very clear that nothing was going to be achieved by the Boundary Commission. Why did Eoin MacNeill keep his own government in the dark? He seemed to have taken a kind of a quasi-judicial role of his position. He saw himself as a judge in chambers with his two colleagues and considered this was not the concern of the Irish government. So when in November 1925 the Morning Post newspaper leaked a report and a map suggesting that the Boundary Commission would only result in minor changes, there was uproar in the Free State. MacNeill was forced to resign from government and from the Commission, and the Irish government sought negotiations in London involving eventually William Cosgrave, the Prime Minister. Collins had died in the Civil War. James Craig, the Unionist Prime Minister, whose slogan was not an inch, and of course Stanley Baldwin, the British Conservative Prime Minister and a friend of Ulster in the Tory tradition. And in the end, of course, the Boundary Commission Award would have granted two important changes. One was that South Armagh, including Crossmaglen, would have gone to the Free State, bringing, perhaps 30,000 nationalists into the Free State. But a rich area of East Donegal, the richest land in Donegal, called the Lagan, running between Derry and Letterkenny, would be transferred to Derry. Northern Ashes never expected Derry to get Donegal, but to stay within Northern Ireland. Of course, a campaign developed in Letterkenny almost immediately, hands off Donegal, and people forgot about Fermanagh and Tyrone. And at those negotiations at Chequers in 1925, actually Cosgrave and Craig got on very well. This is an earlier kind of conference with Ramsay MacDonald, but in 1925 it was Baldwin. And the tripartite agreement had three main recommendations. It confirmed the 1920 border. There would be no change, and the specials who were massed in Fermanagh and Tyrone would not have to fight the Free State Army. Secondly, of course, the Council of Ireland, that nebulous bridge between North and South, which had never really been put into effect, would now disappear by mutual consent. It was agreed by Craig and Cosgrave, we don't need a Council of Ireland, sure, we can meet any time we like to discuss matters of common interest. In fact, they would never meet again. And when an Irish Taoiseach met a Unionist Prime Minister in 1965, when O'Neill met Lemass, there would be hell to pay. And finally, of course, the Irish government received certain financial concessions under Article 5 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. Cosgrave was soon talking about a damn good bargain, exchanging the territory of the Northern Nationalists for financial concessions. The 1925 agreement was a massive blow to Northern Nationalists, whether in West Belfast or on the border, but especially the border nationalists west of the Bann, who had never really adjusted to life in a unionist state, and now found that they were fated to permanent partition. It wasn't until 1925 that Joe Devlin took a seat reluctantly in the Belfast Parliament, followed in 1927 by the border nationalists led by Caibidlí. They would establish a new nationalist party called the National League of the North, but their concessions, their demands for concessions would be rejected, and indeed the only act which the Northern Nationalists secured the passage of in the period 1921 to 32, when they walked out, was the Wild Birds Protection Act of 1931. So in many ways, the border, which had not been in the minds of anyone in 1911, which had been a nebulous proposal in 1913, which had been the subject of acreage debates in 1920, 1922, would eventually become the permanent border of what seemed to be the permanent unionist-dominated state of Northern Ireland by 1925. Thank you very much. Go read the Bible.